Hello! I put a video up a few days ago about game design and creative direction and how you use game design to make sure your game is engaging and you use creative direction to make sure that your game is appealing, and how those things can be interrelated but not necessarily the same thing, and they require different skills and they require you to kind of care about and focus on different things. And one of the things I suggested in the video is that the thing you should be aiming to make when you are initially making a game, if you've got a working prototype and you think it's okay, then the next thing you should be aiming to make is a vertical slice and not a full game. And what we mean by vertical slice, if you imagine a sort of timeline of everything that a player is going to experience in your game, and then you take a slice out of that. It's not necessarily the tutorial. It doesn't have to be the very start of the game that you're trying to model, but you are trying to show people what a certain amount of the game experience is going to be like. Could be 5 minutes, it could be an hour, but the point is that you are, at this point, trying to show people what the final quality and the final style of all the art and stuff like that could be. And someone asked a really useful, interesting question in this regard. Byron Morley said, how do you build a vertical slice for a city builder game where the core loop is the complex economy system? So planning a complex game, like a management game or a strategy game, probably two of the more complex genres of games you could build in terms of being very systems driven and very interface driven as well. And I don't have experience of building one of these from the ground up, but I can tell you how I would do it. And that's what I want to do here, because I gave Byron a reasonably short response here, and I think I can give a more helpful one that will help more people. So if you're making a game in this category of like heavier, more kind of management-based games like city builders or strategy games, then hopefully this is going to be helpful to you. But I'm going to try and explain my thought process sort of visually, because this is what I would do based on my sort of general knowledge about game development and everything else. So what the process normally looks like in game development, I've called this stages of early game development, or proving whether we should even keep making this game. Because what you're trying to do is get from here, from a gameplay prototype, which sort of proves that your game is fun and you can do the thing that you need to do, whatever that technical element is of the game you're trying to make, and you're trying to get to full development. And then vertical slices is the thing in the middle here. It's the thing you do before you do this. And a lot of indie developers don't do this. They sort of start building a game. They don't really prototype in the way that I would understand it, which is about kind of trying things, experimenting and testing. They might do some of that informally, like just kind of by accident, but they don't set out to do it. And then sort of just start adding stuff until you get something that looks more and more like a video game, and hope that things turn out for the best. But this is kind of the process that you would take in industry, and this is the process that kind of more commercially focused small game studios take, and bigger game studios, whether it's in AAA or sort of casual mobile games or whatever. You prototype the game to test if the gameplay works, and then before you go from that into sort of full production or full development and like, okay, we've got a game, let's make 100 levels for it, let's make 20 enemies, let's make 50 weapons. Before you get there and start going in that direction, you then do a vertical slice. And I think the important thing to understand here, in terms of this kind of question that we were asked earlier by Byron about how would you do this for like a complex game with a complex economy, is that at the start, you should have your gameplay prototype, which is to test the game mechanics and basically to test anything that you're unsure of. But you should also have these other things feeding into your vertical slice. So you would have your game design document. You would also have your kind of art style guide, I guess, whatever you want to call it. Sometimes it's called an art bible on kind of media projects, where you have a book that is like, here is how we're doing the art. And the important thing is that this is separate from this, right? Because your prototype probably should be ugly. I saw a really good video about ugly prototypes. I will link it in the description below. Whenever I mention a video in one of these videos, I'm going to give you links in the description. So always check the description afterwards, and there might be other stuff that you'll find useful. But Ideally, your gameplay prototype is to test the interactive elements of your game, and if you start dressing it up and making it pretty too early on, you're going to cause yourself problems because you're going to lock in a lot of things, and then you'll be maybe reluctant to change those things because you spent time on them, or that it will kind of get in the way of your prototyping, because a prototype is meant to test certain concepts like, you know, do these game mechanics work? Do they kind of create the kind of behavior and emotional response that we want from a player? And if the player is sort of blinded by beautiful graphics, then you can't really do a fair test on your game mechanics. And that is why one of the things you would do in the early stages of a project is have a gameplay prototype, and it's specifically called a gameplay prototype here, not a game prototype, because it's not all of the elements of a game. And then you'd be developing other things like your story and your art style in parallel, separately, as a different thing. And the idea there is that you can test these things out individually, and obviously these things all need to come together and they need to work together. And you know, depending on the style of game, you're going to have different art requirements of like, oh, this is a game where you're really close up to the characters, so we need them to have different faces or whatever, versus a game where the characters are very small. All sorts of considerations where the art and the gameplay overlap. But generally speaking, in a bigger team, and especially a team that is working on multiple projects, you would prototype the gameplay first. You would develop the art style as a sort of separate task, not necessarily integrating the art or much of the art. And then the vertical slice is the point at which all of this stuff comes together, which is why I've got all of these arrows pointing towards the vertical slice. So the vertical slice should be like showing people 30 minutes of your game or an hour of your game, whatever is appropriate for the type of game you're making, and saying, this is representative of the final quality. Then from there, as I said, if people like that and they're excited by it, then you know that it's worth going from here into here. But until you know that, it's a big waste of time for yourself to be making loads and loads of levels, loads and loads of additional content for this full development of the game before you've been through these stages of testing. That's sort of the principle behind doing these stages. Now, in relation to Byron's question specifically, I get where you're coming from, because a city builder is a game where there are so many things, and if you have like different levels, like different scenarios in a SimCity game, and it says, hey, you can build Tokyo or you can build London or whatever, when I choose that scenario and I start playing it, I'm going to have access to the entire tech tree. Right? And that makes it difficult to do something like a vertical slice, because, well, in order to do a vertical slice, we need to show people everything, because every kind of city you can build in this game contains everything. So that does present a unique challenge. And FY here, pretty good response. Your vertical slice is some systems, not all the systems. Remember that even a city builder has to be good when you start building the city, not just 2 hours in. So I think this is already a good piece of feedback, but I would go one step further. And again, if you think of this idea that every stage of designing a game, we are testing things, right? We are testing ideas, we are testing concepts. And it's very easy to forget about this. If the game you're building is like a technical learning project for you, like you are learning a game engine as you go, it's very easy to fall into the trap that, you know, everything you do is good because you spent time on it and you learnt a new thing, right? Which is not really how game design works. Game design works on the basis that if players understand it and they find it fun and they find it engaging, then it's good. It doesn't really matter how much time it took you to do that thing. And from a production standpoint, the more fun you can get out of the least work for you, that's the best approach. So to try and directly answer this question of like, how would you build a vertical slice for a city builder game? What I would do, you know, working on the basis that a vertical slice is still testing the game idea out. It's like a checkpoint before we go into full development and we make everything else. Then what I would do is I would take everything in the game and I would separate into these two categories. And one would be genre standards, right? So things that people expect from this genre of game. So my first category of kind of features or things I want to put in my game are genre standards. And my second category is going to be innovations, right? Now, anything that you can think of that you're planning to put in your game is probably going to fall into one of these two categories. So if I'm making a city builder, then one of my sort of standard things in my genre will be something like, I don't know, producing resources, right? So having buildings that produce resources and do something. And then I might have I don't know, transit systems or something like this. Now, on my innovation side, this is going to depend on your game, isn't it? It's going to depend like what sort of game you're making, what the theme is, and all of this kind of stuff. But you're going to have some innovative features over here. So yeah, let's take the game Frostpunk as an example, and let's imagine that Frostpunk doesn't exist, and we're trying to design Frostpunk. There's a list of things in Frostpunk that are genre standards for a city building or a colony management game, right? There's building roads, there's building different types of resource buildings, there's like managing healthcare of like units and stuff like that. These are all things, they don't exist in every single game in the genre, but they're quite standard features that we would expect. And there are things that this game does that are pretty unique, right? So you have to manage the warmth of your colony. You know, you have these heating devices that will have a kind of radius, right? So if you've never played it, it's a great concept because it takes the steampunk genre and it's like, okay, we're going to do a city builder with steampunk, but they've actually made steam a mechanically useful resource because you're in a frozen wasteland and you need to heat that to keep your people alive, keep them healthy, and so on. So that is the sort of thing that I would put under the category of innovation. So warmth, heating system. And then there's like a choose your own adventure style narrative elements, right? So another thing in Frostpunk, when you go out onto the map, your characters have like little adventures and they sort of report back every so often and stuff happens. So that's a thing that is not common within the genre. So put it over here. Why am I doing this? Well, to try and answer Byron's question about how to do a vertical slice with a complex game like this, what I would do is to make these two lists of every feature you want to do in your game and categorize them in this way. You've got your genre standards on one side and you've got your innovations on the other. And then when you set about to build your vertical slice, which you should be building before you build a massive game, because otherwise you're going to waste loads of time and resources on something that people might just not vibe with for whatever reason. And once you've got those two lists, you can then use those two lists to prioritize. Now, if you make that prioritization and everything on that list is a genre standard, then you're not really testing anything with your vertical slice, because the game that you are making is basically then just city skylines, but not very good, right? Your game should never set out to be, oh, here's another game in the genre, and my game is basically the same, and the only thing to differentiate it is that it is worse in a bunch of ways, right? You need to think about how a player is going to receive that, and if your game doesn't have any innovation, doesn't have a unique hook, what's the point in making it? Because all you're doing is making a worse version of something that already exists. And that is why you're going to need to stack your vertical slice with stuff from this column. And the reason for doing that as well is that, again, your vertical slice, it's still following the same logic of prototyping. You're still trying to show people an idea and prove the idea, right? To work out if people like this idea, if they want it. And in order to do that, you need to show them new stuff. Now, this is a balancing act, of course, because if you don't include enough of the genre standards, then people are going to be completely confused and not understand your game, right? If we made Frostpunk and it didn't have producing resources and building roads and managing healthcare, and we just had the warmth and the venturing out onto the map, it would no longer be a game in the genre. It wouldn't be a colony management game or a city builder or however you want to categorize it. So here, what you really need to do is, I would say, maybe it's about 60% of the genre standard features and 40% of your innovations. And maybe it tips slightly either way, but you need that kind of balance. I think you need to build the basis of a game that fans of that genre will understand, and leave out some stuff that you perhaps know you're going to do, but you don't need to test, right? So in a city builder, for example, the plumbing system, the water under the ground, maybe it's something that you want to have in for realism or to have another thing to manage or whatever. But it's not necessarily something you need to have in at a prototype stage, and it's not necessarily even something you need to have in at a vertical slice stage, because it's already proven to work, right? We've seen other games do it. We know that it works. It provides some extra layer of detail that people like, but we don't necessarily need to test it. And it's also not the sort of thing that people will get excited about, right? So we leave it out at the vertical slice stage because it doesn't add much. We need to test a certain amount of innovations. Otherwise, we're not really doing game design. We're just copying another game and making a worse version of it. So there's that balancing act. I can't help you with the specifics of that balancing act, but I would say aim for like a slight majority of features that people know and understand, and then test your most outlandish ideas at the same time, right? Because as I was talking about in the last video, when I talked about, survival crafting games and Pacific Drive, if you've got a unique theme, like Pacific Drive has a unique theme for a survival crafting game. It's a sci-fi game that's all about a retro car, right? Frostpunk has the same thing. It's steampunk, it's in a frosty environment, and what happens in the case of both of these games is the unique theme, which is coming from the creative direction side of things rather than the game design side of things, the unique theme informs the game design and gives it these innovative features, right? The innovative features of Pacific Drive kind of emanate from the fact that it is a game about driving a car in this weird place. The unique features of Frostpunk, which make it stand out in its genre, they emanate from the theme of managing a colony in a particular time period, in a particular type of environment with particular types of threats, and how the kind of technology plays into that, and so on. So all of this is to say that your game needs to have some sort of innovation, and that innovation needs to make sense to the user, which means it needs to kind of come from the theme of the game, right? If you say, I'm going to make Prison Architect, but I'm going to make it be kind of science fiction, right? I'm going to make the same thing, but it's going to be like a prison on the moon, okay? That's pretty cool. I've played sci-fi games in prisons before, like Chronicles of Riddick and stuff like that. What does that theme now give us that we can look at the original set of mechanics we get from a game like Prison Architect, and we can start to twist them and come up with these innovations and stuff? Because that's the kind of stuff that your vertical slice should test. And it should test it both on a does this work kind of playtesting level, and also just to see if people get excited about it. If you've got these two stacks of standard features and innovative features, and you've picked like 3 features from your innovation stack, and you're showing people or you're talking to people about them and no one's getting excited about it, maybe take those out, pick some different features. I do think that sort of complex strategy and management kind of focused games are very difficult to prototype for this very reason. And one of the reasons I bring up Prison Architect earlier is that in the sort of early days of Steam Early Access, it was one of the first games I played through Early Access. And previously I'd played like Dungeon Keeper when that first came out in like the late 90s and stuff like that. Those games were so well structured. You would have a tutorial that was a campaign, and you would get introduced to new things you could build every place you moved and went to a different dungeon and so on. And it was just so well structured. And even though the game came with a manual this thick, it didn't need it, right? And then I had this experience of playing the early access version of Prison Architect when it first came out, and it was just a sandbox. It was a massive sandbox with so much stuff in, and it had never been properly structured into something that sort of tricked you into learning it, right? Which I think is the old school sort of pre-indie boom way of teaching a strategy game, like a Warcraft or a Starcraft. The campaign doesn't give you all of the buildings and units right away. And I know there are some hardcore players who will say, oh, we want everything straight away, but those people are never actually going to be representative of the vast majority of people who play your game. And even people who play these games for a long time and get really hardcore and go on to become like esports players and stuff, they still started out playing that single player campaign that teaches you little bits. But that's kind of another aside. But I would say in the context of this question, trying to build a vertical slice for a very kind of strategic, economically driven game, I would say think about what these elements are that you should have in place before you do a vertical slice. And that might be things like balancing documents, like balancing the game in a spreadsheet. It could be a paper prototype. It could be that you have found it helpful to make a board game version of your city building game or something first. it does help to do that stuff. I know a lot of us think, well, I'm not touching a game engine, so that's not a useful use of my time. But the trouble is, when you're programming and you're putting features into a game, it sort of puts you in a very different mindset to sort of kind of sitting there imagining being a player and going, oh, if I've got 5 factories and 3 farms, like, what am I doing next? What's like my income and so on? It's very hard to kind of think in that way when you're building the thing at the same time. So there might be other types of things you can do before you even go to vertical slice that are kind of giving you more to work with to help you make these decisions about like what is important to prioritize, what is important to put in. But I think this kind of concept here of having these kind of 2 stacks is probably the most helpful thing I can give you at this stage, is come up with a feature list of everything that a hardcore player of your genre would expect to have, right? That is your standard list of stuff. And your intention at the start is to try and fulfill most of that list, right? And if there's anything on that list you're leaving out, it's for good reason. It's because it doesn't fit your theme. It's not just because you don't have time, right? It needs to be a game design reason. And then once you've got that list, you come up with your list of your innovations. And if you don't have any innovations, stop making the game now because it's pointless. If your game has a unique theme, that will be a good place to draw on for your innovations. And I'm going to quickly plug one of my other videos, which I did a few months ago. I played a game called The Hell, which was a city builder based in Hell. And I think this game had the issue of too much innovation at once. It was like maybe missing some core concepts that make the genre go, and it was trying to innovate too much, and it was a little bit confusing, and it often at times felt like I didn't know what I was doing. So I think that might be worth watching if you're interested in this genre of games or you're kind of working in this area. I'll put a link in the description, and hopefully you find that helpful. Let me know what you think. If you've worked on a game in this genre before, like, feel free to drop some science in the comments. Drop some science. Drop some game design science. Let us know what you think, if what I said earlier made sense. And yeah, hope that's been useful to you if this is a genre you're working on.